Hello, welcome to A Life Without Parole. I'm excited today because I have a guest that we are going to be talking about Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke. Ruby Franke is in jail. Well, Jodi and Ruby are both in jail right now because of alleged abuse with Ruby's children. Jodi Hildebrandt is a therapist, and there's a lot of things that have been going on with her that I just questioned in my mind, and I thought, that just doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem right. I just decided I wanted to have a therapist come on and talk about the different things when there's different parts about the way that Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby were doing their connections therapy group. There were just a lot of red flags for me. So I decided that I would check to see if I could get a therapist on here to discuss some of the things that really are red flags. So I would just like to welcome Jill. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you.
This is Jill Tyrrell, and she is a candidate for her master's degree, which she will receive in February. And her degree is in marriage and family therapy. Jill, for this past year, has been working with different types of groups with her interning. So I'm going to go ahead. Jill, welcome. Thank you for coming. Would you like to explain what you've been doing with your internship?
Yes. So for the last year, I've been working at a clinic, and we see primarily children that have experienced trauma, different forms of abuse. We see children, teenagers. We also work with families in addressing these really serious issues of abuse and trauma. We also work very closely with parents and offer parenting classes on how parents can be the best parents that they can be. So I've learned a lot in this last year.
Well, that sounds like a very interesting job and internship. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of tough cases. I really want to hone in on Jodi Hildebrandt. For some reason, when I heard about how she was doing therapy for people, specifically the Frankies, where for a time she actually lived in their house, and she told them as a couple that she was kind of like a marriage counselor, I guess, living at the house, and they couldn't talk to each other without going through her. And then she had all these, alleged abuses, really, that she suggested they do in order to get the children to conform. So is any of that red flags when you're training?
Goodness. As I have watched this case unfold, just the number of red flags have been astonishing. I mean, I obviously am not a seasoned therapist. I'm new to this area of expertise. But just in the small time that I've been in school for the past 2 years, and just with the being the non-expert, it is so clear to me, just the red flags left and right, just the abuse of power, the complete disregard of ethics, the attitude of being above the laws, the rules, the ethical perimeters that are very clearly laid out in this profession for mental health providers. It has been astonishing. And for a therapist that has been practicing on and off for 20 plus years, of course, she knows these basic principles that she has chosen to disregard. I believe that is what has led her to be in this position that she's in now.
Yeah, I have a son who is in his third year in law school, and just because he's in school right now, things like ethics, that just made me think of it. He'll say, I'm in my ethics class right now, and there's just no way this is okay. So
Not
sometimes I think being this close to really going through school, it really makes it so obvious,
right.
that this isn't right. This isn't the way it should be.
No, that's a really great point, because I did have a whole course that was just on ethics and how that applies to us as mental health providers. And we had a whole course on it. Had to write numerous papers on the subject. And even though I had that one ethics class, that is a core concept that is addressed in every single course, because it is that important to this profession. It's something that is continually reminded. It's something that even at my internship location with my supervisors is continually being addressed. So there, having had the background that she has had in the education, she is fully aware of what the professional expectations, the legal expectations are, that she has chosen to disregard, which is alarming to me as going into this profession.
Yeah. So give me a for instance. Let's say that I have a friend who is a therapist. Would it be ethically incorrect for my friend to come to my home and tell me and my husband what to do? I don't know.
Absolutely. That is mental health provider 101, and it's referred to as dual relationships. We
Oh,
have an ethical obligation to not engage in what we call dual relationships. And what that means is, if I'm your therapist, that is my professional title in your life. I'm not also your friend outside of the therapy room. I'm not also your teacher. I'm not also your business partner. Those lines of professionalism are drawn pretty clearly in the sand. Now, dual relationships, of course, there is a spectrum, and there are times where perhaps, if it's going to benefit the client, there is some gray area. For instance, let's say I have a client who I've been working with for a long time, and she's getting married and she wants me to attend a wedding.
mm.
If that is going to be therapeutically beneficial, it's going to enhance that therapeutic relationship, that's something I could consider. But overall, you don't want to have multiple
And
relationship titles with a client,
in the
right?
case of Jodi and Ruby, they were literally friends, business partners, and she was therapist.
Yes. Yes. And the idea is that it blurs the lines between a therapist and a client, and it can create conflicts of interest. But there's the potential for exploitation, for abuse of power, because when you're a therapist, it's a position of power that is taken seriously. And if those lines are blurred with that relationship, you could easily use that power to exploit, to manipulate, and it could be really harmful to the therapeutic process. In fact, just the other day, I had a client come to me. She's a teenager, and asked if I would give her a reference for a job. And I counseled with my supervisors, and we concluded that was a dual relationship, that I'm her therapist. I would be crossing the line of my therapeutic boundary with her to offer her a reference for a job. So that's how seriously it's taken, because it really is to protect both the client and the therapist.
When I think about the relationship that she had with her niece, where her brother dropped his daughter off, who he said he was having trouble with, and just left him to her, and she, the abuses that were, and
Yes.
this was her niece.
Yes, there was a lot of abuse in that case.
I'm amazed that she hasn't lost her license over these things.
I am too. I mean, I mean, she did lose her license temporarily, right?
Yeah.
But it was due to something else that we'll probably talk later on
Yeah.
about, when it came to confidentiality, which is
Right.
another huge no-no in our profession, breaking
Yeah.
confidentiality without specific limits. There are specific limits of confidentiality, but she clearly crossed the line.
Yeah.
And I mean, at the end of the day, as mental health providers, we are ethically mandated to be very careful about dual relationships. That is part of how we become licensed, is by abiding by that, because it does protect both of us. It protects the client and the therapist.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, now let's talk about some of her therapy techniques. For instance, withholding food, withholding water, chaining them to the floor. I mean, how's that fall into the therapy rules?
So yes, it is illegal to withhold the necessities of life from a child.
Mm.
Under the law, withholding the necessities of life, food, water, proper housing, that is illegal.
And I mean, if you're chained to
And
the floor, you can't even go to the restroom. I mean,
right. It is abuse, and any excessive physical restraint for an extended period of time is considered child abuse. And now each state does have little tweaks in what they consider child abuse. I mean, each state has their own, as you kind of narrow down the definition, but the withholding the necessities of life across the board is considered child abuse. And even there are limits on spanking, depending on what state you're in, where if you cross a line, it can be considered child abuse, depending on what state you're in. So yes, and it's hands down considered abuse, child abuse.
okay, so I have some questions that I had thought up earlier. Should a therapist live with the family to give marriage counseling?
So this again goes back to a dual relationship. And while there is a spectrum of what's appropriate, my opinion, and I think it's safe to say many others would look at this as a dual relationship. I think that's the first infraction, is that you can't be a therapist and also be a tenant, also be a roommate, that's crossing the line. The second principle that I think that this violates is the idea of what we call triangulation in relationships. So triangulation occurs when there's one person that maybe holds power, communicates between two others. So my understanding was that Jodi was kind of the go-between between.
Yeah, that's the way that the husband is explaining it now.
Right, which is considered triangulation, and that limitation of the communication and having that power of all the communication going through one person is a form of manipulation. And yeah, and it's a way of, with that type of power and that type of manipulation, there is that tendency to kind of pit the two against each other. So it can be very destructive in family systems. It's something we see a lot, triangulation in family systems. It's something that we try to rectify as a therapist. But as a therapist, we also have to be very careful that we are not triangulating with our clients. Like if I'm seeing a couple, I have to be very cognizant of not taking one side over the other. Or that could be seen as triangulation. I have to stay objective and supportive of both of those clients. And I just don't see how that would happen if you were living with someone in their home and communicating for them. It just feels like a recipe for disaster.
So do you think that it's possible that Ruby, I can't think of her husband's name now, it'll come to me. Do you think that they have an argument for, oh, we're not to blame because Jodi made us do it. We just were doing what our therapist said. And
oh goodness, that's a big question. And where is that line of the power that Jodi holds, right? Because when you are a counselor, a therapist, a mental health provider, it is a position of power that you have of influencing people's lives. And that is that's a legitimate argument, right? Of what kind of influence did she have? At the end of the day, they are adults that have to be accountable for their behavior. So that's really tricky.
Yeah, I think there's a video, and I'll probably put it in here, a clip of Ruby, when she's doing her 8 passengers, but she basically talks about how if you see that your child is on fire, you're not going to tell him what to do. You're going to throw him to the ground and beat the fire out of him, and that's going to save him. And I think in some weird way, she might have been talking about the way that she controls her kids. It wasn't really about fire.
Anyway, so I'm just going to love you where you are right now. No, you throw them on the ground and you start rolling them. You get a blanket and you start hitting the flames. And they're going to say, you're hurting me. You're beating me. You're controlling. It's like, no, dear, hold still. I'm getting the fire out. That's what a loving parent does. And because nobody will do it, it looks to the world crazy. And because they've never been loved before, it looks like I'm angry. To them, it looks like I'm controlling. It looks like I'm militant. It looks like I'm a monster.
Is this an example of Ruby and Jodi's way of justifying their actions? And I think in some weird way, she might have been talking about the way that she controls her kids. It wasn't really about fire. It was about gaining control. And it sounds like the same words that Jodi was using with her niece all those years ago. So it sounds like it came from, Jodi. But I can tell you this, there's no therapist in the world that's going to talk me into beating up my children.
No.
So.
Yes. And I mean, that's a great question. Where that line is of their responsibility, will be left to the court at this point, right? Where that responsibility lies. And obviously what I'm sharing is just my opinion, and
right.
But that's an excellent question. Where is that line of what her influence was and the responsibility she has versus their responsibility for their actions? Okay.
All right. Our next question I have, what about a therapist? We've talked about this a little bit, but a therapist who notifies clergy about so-called confessions during therapy sessions.
Yes. So when I learned about her track record of informing clergy of clients, what she felt were transgressions or inappropriate behavior, in my opinion, I was just dumbfounded that she would take the liberty of breaking confidentiality, because again, that is therapy 101, confidentiality. So much of our work is based on a client feeling safe and feeling like there is that what they say in the therapy room is held confidential, that it's not going to be shared. Now, there are some limits to our confidentiality, but from what I understand, what these men did not fall into the realm of why you would break limits of confidentiality. So therapists are considered mandated reporters. Mental health providers are mandated reporters. And what that means that if a client says something to us that makes us think they're going to hurt themselves, other people or like a building, like threatening to bomb a building, or if they tell us something about a child being abused, elderly being abused, or someone who is a disabled adult being abused, we are mandated by law to report that. So those are really the only reasons that we would break confidentiality. And from what I understand, these clients, it was not an ethical reason to report them or to share it with their clergy. It just seemed like a huge breach of professionalism and also spiritual manipulation. So it was an abuse of power, in my opinion, to do that. The other thing about doing that, there's something, again, that we're trained as therapists, as mental health providers, which is called, we try to maintain unconditional positive regard for our clients. And what that means is that a client needs to feel like no matter what they say to us, whether we agree, whether it's in line with our morals or not, that we're going to be non-judgmental. We're going to hold that space for them to share basically the good, the bad, and the ugly, unless it's in the realm of those limits that I already explained. We hold our clients in unconditional positive regard, regardless of maybe what our morals are or our spiritual beliefs. And that's a foundational tenet that we learn in school.
One thing that comes to my mind, just from what's already been brought out in the court case, the civil case with Ruby-Franke in it, and it was leaked out into the public. It wasn't supposed to be, because it was about their child custody things. But the fact is, Ruby and Jodi were claiming that a 3-year-old was addicted. I'm not going to say what, because YouTube won't like it. But you get what I'm saying. I feel like Jodi would claim people were things when it's one little thing, instead of, I don't know how to, I'm not explaining very well. But I think that there were, let's say you are somebody who you never want to drink alcohol in your life. You never want to touch it once. But one time you had half a beer, and then your therapist tells you you're an alcoholic. And you are, the rest of your life, you're an alcoholic. And that's what it felt like, allegedly, according to the people that are coming forward. I have a connection with somebody. They do not want to go public right now, but they were in marriage counseling with Ruby-Franke, or with Jodi Hildebrandt.
Mm-hmm.
And they now, after 3 years ago, they got divorced. They now believe they wouldn't have gotten divorced had they not been going to her for therapy, because she was doing that weird manipulation thing where she would call drinking a half a beer an alcoholic. And they would believe it.
Yeah, and that's very, very unfortunate. And I think as mental health providers, we do have a lot of influence on our clients, and we do have to be very careful of the things that we say, and any diagnosis that we throw out. We need to be very careful. And going back, one more thing about confidentiality that I did want to say, there are also HIPAA laws that protect this information. And so it's not a surprise that she temporarily had her license revoked. I guess I'm surprised that she had it reinstated after such a breach of confidentiality. But apparently, from what I understand, she went through an appeal process and got it back after 5 years. So,
and I think that there are people out there, and I didn't know them at all. Like, I had not followed 8 Passengers. I didn't know anything about them until all this came about. But I definitely know people in my life who can put on a good talk. Like, I feel like, oh, they are so smart. They know everything about baseball or whatever it is, And I think that people fell for, I think that there's some sort of charisma involved and certainly the power. I think it's interesting that Ruby kind of gave herself her own title. I can't even remember what it's called on Connections, like a
It's like a mental
physical
health coach.
mental health coach. She has no schooling, no education, but she titled herself. I'm going to title myself the I don't know what, but it's
Yeah.
ironic because on their website it makes you think that she's a therapist too, and
Yeah, and
those videos.
and that's another realm. I don't know, maybe that's another a different podcast or video, but I think we do have to be careful when we're finding life coaches and look carefully at what their credentials and their training are. I think there are some excellent life coaches out there. There's some therapists that aren't great. Just for people to really do their homework, look at the credentials.
What is the credentials needed to call yourself a life coach?
That's the thing. I think it varies greatly. I think some it's a very minimal online training. And it's just something just to be mindful of looking at someone's background carefully, of what kind of training do they have?
I think I could title myself the sugar cookie coach. I can tell you what sugar cookies are good, which was not.
Yeah, I like
but I'm just saying, like, anybody could call themselves anything, really. Right?
You could, yes. I mean, you have to be really careful about that.
Do life coaches have different rules per state? Is that a different?
The life coaching is just it's not regulated the same way.
Okay, so let's talk about what it is, like, really, and we don't want to, like, offend anyone out there who's life coaches, but what kind of schooling, how rigorous is it to become a therapist?
It is a lot of time and money and effort and supervision. So first of all, you have to have a bachelor's degree first. Then you go for your graduate degree, a master's. So that's an additional 2 years of, at least a minimum of 2 years of schooling, depending on your program. At least a year of some sort of internship practicum where you're working underneath a licensed psychotherapist. I'm required for each program's a little different. I've had to have 300 hours of meeting with clients. I've had to have a certain amount of hours of being supervised, live supervisions, recordings that are supervised. And then after meeting those requirements of graduation, then I am required to practice as a therapist under a licensed therapist for 2 years before I can even become licensed. So
really, it's almost like 3 because you already did a year of internship.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty rigorous, and I'm monitored very closely by 3 different supervisors.
Wow.
That I have to account for and I have to be accountable for. I have to write detailed notes that have to be, HIPAA compliant, and I have to be very careful of how I store my information. Everything, all of my records are under lock and key. I have to be if I record any sessions, it has to be through a recording system that is HIPAA compliant. It's taken that, again, that confidentiality is so huge. But at the end of the day, I mean, the rigorous educational training, supervision that you go through to be a mental health provider is pretty thorough. And I do recognize there are life coaches that are very good at what they do. I don't know what is required. I just know that to be a licensed psychotherapist in any of in the mental health realm, I mean, it does take a lot of schooling, a lot of supervision, and a lot of practice before you can even become a licensed therapist.
So I think the trouble with this case is somebody who did all of that became a therapist, and apparently a pretty good one, and then started having her own like
Yeah.
version of almost like a break off of what therapy teaches. And she came up with her not only her own way of doing therapy, but she, almost like their own language. And that's one thing that Ruby Franke's kids said, that they started to not have friends because their language, the way they talked, wasn't correct according to what this therapist was telling them how they need to talk.
Yeah, I heard
That's
that
a
as
whole
well.
new, almost like a whole new culture
It is.
hiding in plain sight.
Yes. And I think just the liberties that she took, I mean, no, being a licensed therapist, understanding some of these core principles of ethics and morals in this area of practice, and the complete disregard for not only the ethics and principles of our industry, but laws, disregarding laws of what child abuse is. In my opinion, it's very narcissistic to feel like you are above it. You're above the rules. That you can make up the rules as you go, so to speak.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that, I feel, going on with them. Okay, how about a therapist that contacts employers to say they are unfit to work at a university, which is what she did.
Oh my goodness.
And this might even tie in a little bit with religion, because she's taking a religious population and she's kind of using that. So yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Again, it goes back to breaking confidentiality,
which
is just such a huge, there was, my understanding is there was nothing she was reporting to the school that would have been under that umbrella of the limits of confidentiality. They were not harming themselves or others. That again, she used her power to, I feel, to be quite manipulative and to exert power over someone that she really didn't have the right to do.
Is there any therapy where confinement is a beneficial way to get results?
No, absolutely not.
Let me say one thing before you fully answer. So apparently, I don't know if you've heard about Paris Hilton and her whole, like, she got taken away because she was in trouble when she was a teenager. Her parents sent her to this camp in Provo, and it was run by Jodi Hildebrandt. And they definitely did like all kinds of restriction, confinement type therapy. So go ahead.
So, I was really interested in just, what are the laws and what is considered child abuse? And when I was kind of looking at some definitions, it says using excessive physical restraint or extended periods of isolation as a means of controlling your child's behavior.
But she did both.
That is considered child abuse.
Wow.
Yeah.
She's going to have some years, I think. This is all, I mean, allegedly, she hasn't been found guilty yet.
Right.
But
yep.
What do you think about a therapist who tells their clients that they're lying and just keeps on going and going and going, which is what she did to her niece and probably others, but she would accuse her of things that never happened, but she did it so often that the niece started confessing, even though they never happened.
I mean, in my opinion, this is a complete abuse of power. That kind of coercive, manipulative behavior is destructive. And also it goes against something that a lot of therapeutic models, especially some of the more postmodern therapies, aspire to, which is the client is the expert of their life. The client is the expert. Now, as therapists, we are experts in leading a conversation to be therapeutic. We're an expert in applying certain model techniques. We're an expert in perhaps even some assessment. But at the end of the day, it's that individual that is an expert in their own life. And believing them when they say, I'm not lying.
Yeah.
I am telling the truth.
So
And
she's been trained about all this. She's just manipulated it around in a narcissistic way.
When you consider the client an expert in their own life, they're a part of setting the goals for therapy, right? You don't, as a therapist, say, these are your goals. Like,
Oh, yeah.
they're a part of setting those goals, and it's what we call client-centered therapy, where they help determine what those goals are, and they get to determine what they want to work on and what they want to improve in their life. It's not up to a therapist to dictate, these are your goals, these are the things you should do, and these are the things that you shouldn't do.
Love that.
That's just out of the therapeutic realm. That's to do that.
Tell me your thoughts about this alleged therapist, meaning Jodi Hildebrandt, who destroys a man's reputation to the point he himself starts to believe they are not worthy of a marriage or a family relationship. Now, that's what Ruby's husband is alleging, that he didn't feel, according to his attorney, he didn't feel worthy because he was thinking about money or thinking about worldly things. And they told him, Ruby and Jodi told him, you're out. You can't be a husband. You can't be a father. You have to move out. And he did it for 13 months, had no contact.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is an accumulation of all the things we've talked about. Yeah. I mean, dual relationship, the abuse of one's power, the not having the unconditional positive regard, not allowing the client to be an expert in their own life, and clearly crossing a lot of boundaries in that therapeutic relationship.
So how does someone who's wanting to go through therapy, how do they protect themselves from, I mean, you have to let it go a little or else therapy won't work, but how do you protect yourself from someone who's manipulating you in a bad way?
So are you meaning like if you're the client?
If I'm the client, how would I protect myself if I went to Jodi Hildebrandt and I believed what she was saying was right?
I think you have to trust your instincts. I think we have a built-in radar a lot of times when our boundaries are being crossed, when we feel there is that imbalance of power. I think a lot of us do have that internal radar when something is off. And I think if you're ever with a therapist and you feel uneasy or uncomfortable, to listen to that or bring it up in therapy. Talk to the therapist about it. But that is one thing, as I've looked at some of the reviews of people that were in the Connections program, that I kind of see over and over, that there were things being taught that were not sitting well, that people felt uneasy about. And some did listen to that intuition and did not stay in the program. And I think just listening to that instinct, if you feel uncomfortable, not to ignore it.
I feel so bad for the young children who didn't get a choice, and especially that boy who escaped the house and then he's starving and thirsty but is still saying, but it's my fault. It's my fault. Like he didn't even feel like he deserved.
I know. And that is, yeah, I mean, that is tragic. The mental, emotional abuse that went along with the physical abuse, that they are to that point where they've been manipulated and brainwashed and gaslit enough that they think they're to blame. There's something in parent that I've learned in my schooling. It's the parenting styles, and there's the permissive, the authoritative, the authoritarian, and the uninvolved. And they've done numerous studies on like what is effective, what's most effective. And it is the authoritative. It's the authoritarian style that has been implemented by Ruby and by Jodi. And it's that very authoritarian, no little warmth. You will do as I say. There's punishments, there's power. From what I understand, like in the connections, they were against kids having privacy. The parents were always right. So it falls under what we call authoritarian. And there have been so many studies on this that it is not a healthy way to parent children. Children that grow up with this parenting style often have low self-esteem. They're hostile. They have anxiety and depression. That is not, and that's what Ruby aspires to, right? And that's very much what the Connections program is. It's a very authoritarian style of parenting, which does not produce healthy results in the long run. It's the authoritative, which is the, let's talk about it and let's have standards but let's have reasonable consequences and let's talk about it together. And it's that regard for a child's feelings and regard for a child's privacy. And studies have shown that is what creates healthy adults and a healthy esteem and healthy sense of responsibility.
I was thinking about how, here's an example. One of Ruby's sons pulled a prank on his little brother, and mom and dad didn't like that prank, and they took his bedroom away for something like 7 months.
My bedroom was taken away for 7 months, and then you give it back like a couple weeks ago.
I don't think our viewers know that.
You've been sleeping on a beanbag.
I've been sleeping on a beanbag since October, and they gave my room back like 2 weeks ago. I'll give you the reason why I lost my bedroom. I think so. I think this is the reason. At least this is the reason that's in my head. It's pretty funny, but now that I look back, I think it's pretty depressing.
No, we never told our viewers.
That I woke Russell up at 2 in the morning and told him that we're going to Disneyland and he has to pack. And he got up and made his bed all neatly and then packed all his clothes in the suitcase. And then he walked out the door and I'm like, Russell, and he's like, what? And he's all happy. Has his sunglasses on.
I think it's funny because
And then I walked out.
if you think it's funny, then that was 7 months ago. Maybe you need longer without a bedroom.
It was not funny.
Russell got the big bedroom and Chad got the smaller bedroom, and Russell's bigger bedroom also had a bathroom. But what you guys didn't know was Chad didn't get any room. He didn't get anything. He was sleeping on the floor in the family
He
room.
had and all of their rooms had no doors, bathrooms, no doors. So you're totally describing the way that they were raised, and that's tough. I think about my own parenting style. When my kids were really young, I had rules like you can't run out in the street, and that's 100% no. And almost everything else we could negotiate,
Right.
Talk to me, tell me why you think you deserve that or whatever.
Exactly. And
But
that's
they didn't get any choices.
Yeah, and that's the authoritative, which is what we want to aim for, is the let's talk about this. It's the explaining the why behind a rule, and it's explaining the why a consequence is connected to a behavior, and it's a consequence. It's not as much of a punishment. It's the punitive, controlling punishment with no explanation, no regard for a child's feelings or opinions or privacy. That is that authoritarian parenting, again, which is just, studies have shown that is not what produces mentally, emotionally healthy adults in the long run.
I think about people that have like the most strict rules, and with their kids. And a lot of times they just learn to comply with what their parents want. But the second their parents' eyes are turned, that there's no, all bets are off, because they can't live by all the rules. And I wonder if that's part of what made a passenger such a big thing for millions of people, that just, it's almost like watching a car wreck. Like, do they really do this?
I
is
know.
crazy. Makes everybody uncomfortable.
It does. And I think it goes back to having that innate sense. A lot of us have that kind of innate moral compass when we see something that is off. And I remember it was probably about a year ago, my daughter showed me a 8 passengers video, and I was very uncomfortable with the way she was parenting. I was very uncomfortable with the fact that she was videotaping these children as she was doling out this very punitive, cruel, and in my opinion, punishments for these children.
Yeah, it's so sad. Well, I think we got through it all. Thank you so much, Jill, for joining me, and I'll definitely have you on again if you don't mind, and we'll another show. See ya.